and good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Richard Corneal, and I'm the principal of Assumption University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation in the Christian Culture series. Before I just go any further, I just want to say a quick thank you to Father Maurice and the Assumption Parish team for working with us to host the presentation here this evening. So thank you, Father Maurice. There you go. Thank you. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Daniel Mcleod. This has been a very special day for the MacLeod family with the dedication of the Alistair MacLeod Walk on the University of Windsor campus, and Assumption's really happy to be able to continue the celebrations this evening with Dan's presentation. Dr. Daniel Mcleod is Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies and History at the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies, St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba. He's worked there since 2014. He completed his PhD in 2013 at the Center for Scottish Studies at the University of Guelph, and he was co-editor of Keeping the Kirk, Scottish Religion at Home and in the Diaspora, the third volume of the Guelph series in Scottish Studies. He has published research on Scottish Jesuits, especially St. John Ogilvie, and on the Reformation in Glasgow. He is currently investigating changing approaches to time in the period surrounding the Scottish Reformation. Dan and his family live in Winnipeg, but we all know that he is a son of Windsor. A significant piece of news that I'm pleased to pass on to you is that recently Dan was appointed the director of the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies at St. Paul's College. Yes. The title of Dr. Mcleod's presentation this evening is Changing Church, Catholics, Protestants, and the Reformation of Religious Lives in Early Modern Scotland. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Mcleod.
Okay, that's loud. It's my great pleasure and honor to be here today and to speak about my research and the changes to Christian life brought on by the Reformation, 16th century. It's especially great to be doing this talk here in this church. This is where I was baptized. This is where I received nearly all of my sacraments, where 2 of my 3 sons were baptized. And this church, of course, a big part of my own life and the life of my family. So I was very pleased to be asked by Richard to come. I'm also excited to be doing this for Assumption University, my former employer. I washed the dishes, at O'Connor House throughout university, and I worked at Assumption University washing dishes as well, sometimes for Christian Culture series talks, most of them better than what you're about to hear. And in that work, I had the great pleasure to come to know so many Basilians who were my teachers, my bosses, my canoe trip partners, and remain my friends. Father Rennick and Father Hibbard married my wife and I. Father Rennick, former president of Assumption, baptized 2 of my children. And so it's just very nice to be here, and I look forward to sharing a bit of my work with you. So tonight I'm going to talk about how the experience of church was changed in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then hopefully try to make some connections with how these changes might remain relevant to church and society maybe in the present day. This year, 2017, marks a number of relevant anniversaries that historians have gone to great lengths to document. Of course, we had Canada's 150th anniversary and the celebrations marking the 250th anniversary of this parish. Of course, have been prominent in our community here, and for people in and around Windsor. And in my line of work, as a historian of the early modern world, the big anniversary in 2017 has been marking the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther, and this is where I do this. Martin Luther's protest that led to what we now know as the Reformation, and his becoming, in many people's views, the first Protestant. In 1517, with his famous posting of his 95 Theses, his subjects for debate on a church door in Wittenberg, Luther protested against the Roman Catholic Church to which he had devoted his whole life. He decided to do this when he was about 18 months younger than I am. And he did so with a combination of bravery and anxiety that one might expect from these people behind these major moments in our past. And although he couldn't have conceived the forms of Protestantism, the forms Protestantism would take, and although he surely would not have approved of most of the derivations of Christianity that were to come in the next 500 years, Luther's influence was significant, and there's no doubt that he birthed new ways of thinking and behaving that changed Western civilization in fundamental ways. I have a colleague who doesn't particularly like celebrating anniversaries or important dates in history, primarily because he thinks these celebrations never end, and they facilitate kind of incorrect understandings of history, overly focused on single moments. 90th anniversary of this birth, 170th anniversary of that death, 800th anniversary of this moment, so on. And there's a point in my colleague's critique in that marking anniversaries disguises where history is mostly lived, in the small interactions and moments of our lives, and that the documenting of these major events sometimes obscures the importance of the everyday, and certainly this is true. But it's also true that anniversaries provide us with moments to consider these events carefully and to consider change over time, the principal endeavor of my life as a historian. So tonight, I'm going to talk first about the world of early modern Christianity, and then the strategies used to change church with the arrival of Protestantism in later 16th century Scotland, which led to further changes as Catholics and others resisted the new church, and that made their old church and the ways of approaching the sacred that came with that old church illegal in Scotland. And finally, I'll try to make a few comments as to why an understanding of the Reformation is valuable in our world today, and why it might be of interest to here in our small but mighty community. So the history of the Catholic Church and of Christianity more generally is marked very much by a give and take between uniformity and diversity. Institutions decide what they take or what they do not take from the cultures in which they operate. This has been the story of the history of Christianity from its earliest days, as it sought to balance East and West, old and new, etc. But with Luther's Reformation, the diversity of opinion that had always characterized Christian churches turned into something more, a world in which groups formed entirely new faith communities and alternative ways of thinking about God or about how God's church should operate here on earth. And one thing that really marked the Reformation era is the degree to which new Christian denominations built on one another and made even newer churches on the backs of other relatively new churches, each of them with the idea that they were forming the Church of Jesus Christ, the oldest church of all. In this, or the oldest Christian church. In this way, the Reformation was very much an exercise of historical revision. And here we have some of our English people talking about a catalog of several sects and opinions in England and other nations. So there's the evil Jesuits, and here's some libertines smashing all the rules of law. There's a divorcer. Here's an Anabaptist. And here's an Adamite, and they were wishing to get back to the real early church, so they practiced Christianity naked. So I'll examine the diversity of that brought on Scottish Protestantism in a few minutes, but I think it's important to point out that Catholicism in the 16th and 17th centuries displayed a tremendous diversity as well. And that diversity was buoyed by the dynamism of late medieval Catholicism and to some degree by the Council of Trent. But these centuries changed the Catholic Church primarily through their interactions with the cultures they encountered all over the world, through the intense missionary activity that took place first by Franciscans and Dominicans, and then most prominently with the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. And as many of you know, the Jesuits were the order that in the early 18th century founded the mission among the Hurons of Detroit that would begin the life of our present Assumption community. And the story of Assumption was not a straightforward one, and as we know, the local church community has expanded and contracted over the years, having been influenced by smaller and larger cultural changes. And the complexity of Assumption's case fits well with the story of the vastly expanding Catholic world in the previous couple of centuries, a phenomenon that I think is best represented by this image, which we take from the middle of the 17th century. This is what we might call the Ignatian tree, but it is here called the Universal Horoscope of the Society of Jesus. It is an image created by the remarkable Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher in his 1646 treatise, The Art of Light and Shadow. And here Kircher represents his order in a tremendously complex and beautiful way. We see the trunk of the tree. I have a more close-up version there. So that's St. Ignatius at the bottom, representing, the Jesuits, the founder of the Jesuits. And then the tree goes up, and the trunk of the tree representing the assistancies of the Jesuit order, St. Ignatius at the bottom, and then the provinces, and then the countries, and all with their little towns and colleges and individual missions and apostolates. And around the outside, we see some of the Jesuit martyrs and a collection of psalms translated into the languages spoken in these places where the Jesuits were. An olive tree in the house of God, Psalm 51. From the rising of the sun to its going down, blessed be the name of God, Psalm 113. Each region is further represented by a sundial, which tells us if you put a pin, here, it will tell you the time in these Jesuit places as it relates to Rome. It shows, of course, the tremendous, so the other thing they say is that if you put a pin here, and then, as the day goes on in Rome, it will tell you the different times of the day. And if you put a pin in all of them, it gives you the IHS, like the Christogram of the Society of Jesus. This is a treatise about, Athanasius Kircher was a scientist, essentially. It was a treatise about how shadows work when light is applied to, how light and shadow interact. But he used this treatise of shadow to represent his order and all the places in which they operate. And when I read about the Jesuits, I'm relentlessly struck by the breadth of this influence and the remarkably complex places that they all operated, all according to relatively simple rules. The early Jesuit, Jerome Nadal, said, "What is the job of the Jesuit? To help souls." And then people would ask follow-up questions. "What do you mean? Help souls," he would say. And if we look at the far right of this image, here is, where is it? Peru. And here, in the one little leaf, in this one little, place in all of our world, we have Cusco in Peru. And on this one little leaf, we can learn a little bit about how the diversity of this Catholic experience in the world. And in this one little leaf, we can learn about this church, the Companion Church in Cusco in Peru, which is based off the Church of the Jesuit in Rome, the mother parish of the Jesuits. And they look very similar, but this is made in what they call the Andean Baroque style. And in Cusco as well lived this Jesuit linguist named Alonso de Barzano, who died in Cusco and spent a lot of time there. And when Barzana came to Peru, he learned 11 Peruvian indigenous languages. He wrote in 5 of these languages. He produced a lexicon and a catechism in these languages, all to help share the Catholic message. And there were schools and churches established in these same sites, and they worked to spread Christianity by visual art, architecture, music, in these regions that were far different from the European cosmopolitan context in which all of these Jesuits were trained. And on the left side of the tree, you can't really see it here, on the left side of the tree is Canada. And the Jesuits came, this is in 1646, and the Jesuits came to Canada in 1611, so they don't really have detailed leaves yet. But one of these leaves eventually would be Assumption. And all of these leaves and all of the story that we're writing books about celebrating is one little leaf in this global story of early modern Catholicism. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, these opportunities for growth in the New World came as a boon to European Catholics who had endured and were continuing to endure the wars and hardships that came with the European Reformations. And much of my own work concerns how these Catholics reacted when Catholic territories became Protestant. The primary geographic region for my work is in Scotland, particularly Glasgow, in the 16th and 17th century when the Reformation was beginning to take hold. The brand of Protestantism that came to Scotland was Big R Reformed and was in line with John Calvin's church in Geneva, where Scotland's most famous reformer, John Knox, had lived and worked with Calvin, John Knox, who had lived and worked with Calvin in the mid-1550s. In his time in Geneva, John Calvin had 38 different laws drawn up against the evil sin of dancing. But one historian has said that John Knox out-Calvined Calvin in Scotland, and indeed the church that Knox tried to build in Scotland was uncompromising in its pursuit of what he called a godly society. And as you might expect, Roman Catholicism became a particular target of the newly reformed Kirk. Kirk simply being the Scottish word for church, Scots word for church. And although he began as a Catholic, a priest no less, John Knox did not have very many good things to say about Catholics. Knox called the celebration of the Catholic Eucharist the fountain and spring of all other evils in the realm, and is well known to have used Mary, Queen of Scots' maintenance of the Mass as a particular target of his ire. Knox was also famously critical of the Catholic clergy. He called them the dumb dogs with their idle bellies, whom he thought bastardized Christianity. He called Gavin Dunbar, the Archbishop of Glasgow, a glorious fool, and said of Archbishop James Beaton in St. Andrews, as he sought the world, it fled him not. In Beaton's case, he may have been correct. For example, 2 years after Beaton's castle was sacked in 1515, the Archbishop took legal action against those who sacked it for the recovery of the goods that had been taken during this event 2 years before. And the detail of the list of items Beaton hoped to recover reveals the opulence of his palace as well as the quality of his memory after 2 years. Included in the materials are 26 feather beds, 12 tin pints, 18 pots, 13 pans, 12 pounds of pepper, 2 pounds of saffron, 9 pounds of sugar, 1 gilded crossbow, 4 regular crossbows, 6 barrels of gunpowder, on and on. So even though Knox might tend to overdo his insults of Catholics, sometimes the shoe fit. But opulence aside, church began to change in a serious way at the Reformation Parliament in 1560, where Catholicism was made explicitly illegal. And the church would have to go underground and exist under these conditions for quite some time. Full restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in Scotland would not occur until 1878. Many Catholics simply moved over to the new church. The Scottish Reformation was certainly not a popular revolt of everyday Christians, and so many Christians just saw the writing on the wall and knew that their familial, their social, their economic relationships would be negatively affected by the failure to conform to these conditions. But some Catholics continued to practice their faith under these conditions. They snuck in priests, they hid Catholic books in their attic, they formed informal networks of Scottish Catholics in their town. And when we look at the documents of the 16th century church, we can find them there, adhering to their Catholic faith under difficult conditions. Before I talk about the Catholics I find in these documents, I think it's important to say a little bit about the documents themselves. I work primarily with the sources from the Kirk Session, which is the lowest church court of the Presbyterian system in the Scottish Church. Kirk Sessions existed in most Scottish towns by the 1580s, and they were the most local institution in the church. In these documents, we get a very good sense of what is happening in the 16th century. The minute books of the session are very similar to the minute books of the parish council here at Assumption. They deal with mundane things a lot of the time. Repairs to the church, human resources, subcommittees devoted to the care for the poor, or communicating with neighboring churches. Sometimes an exceptional case will show itself, but for the most part, they are the week-to-week documenting of parish life. But they are remarkable because everyone was subject to the session. And in examining the session books, we can learn a lot from not only the actions of these people, but also their names: lepers, witches, vagabonds, drunkards, all on the same books as kings, archbishops, ministers, everybody there together. And to give you a sense of what these documents are like, here is a copy of the first available page in the Glasgow Kirk Session records. This is what I do most of my work with, these documents. And I must admit, it's a bit of a rude awakening. This is called, "Here Follows the Punishment for Fornicators." And then on the right-hand side, there's a list of elders who are charged with enforcing these rules. It notes that the elders here are presented for approval by the congregation 434 years ago tomorrow, November 7th, 1583. And the first page, although it's not what all session documents look like, it does give a sense of how this justice system worked, usually with more severe punishments for more offenders. So this is the first page. Here follows the punishment for fornicators, and this is what it says. That is to say, for the first fault as well, the man and the woman shall pay 40 pounds money, and they both shall be in prison for the space of 8 days. Their food to be bread and small drink. Small drink is beer. and thereafter to be put in the market cross of the town, and the parish bareheaded, that means without a hat, bareheaded, and there stand fashioned to the town square for the space of, here we are, for the space of 10 hours to 12 hours noon, for 2 hours. So that's if you get caught fornicating once. But second time, for the second time, they'll pay 100 merks. The 4 days of their prison shall be doubled, and their food to be bread and water only, so no more beer, just water. And in the end, to be presented to the market cross, and both the heads of the man and the woman to be sheafened, shave their heads. And for the third fault being convicted of, they'll pay 100 pounds. Their above imprisonment to be tripled, and their food and bread water only. And then to be taken to the deepest and foulest water in the town or parish, and there to be thrice dunked in the dirtiest water in the town 3 times, and thereafter to be banished from the town forever. So, yeah, it does take a bit of the fun out of it. In reading these documents, people can get a sense of how church was changed in the 16th century in Glasgow, a middling Scottish town, which was at the time had a population just a bit larger than Harrow. 2 central ways in which I examine how church was changed, and its approaches to time and its approaches to the sacraments are much on display in these documents. And examining these 2 changes, to the matters at the heart of Christian life, we're able to see some larger themes, especially those related to how Catholics resisted the new church and insisted their voices were heard. First, time. Time is, of course, one of our primary concerns in the present day and the basic unit of the historian's work. We also seem to always want more of it. We're careful to warn people against wasting it. Most of our productivity is governed by a clock. And it's hard to imagine our lives in modern North America without these measurements. And investigations of time are also woven into so many themes of Christianity. Before Jesus' time, the book of Ecclesiastes gave us the Bible's most famous statement on time. It told us there was a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, time to pluck up what is planted, and so on. And Jesus, of course, was a game changer when it came to time. Among the fundamental miracles of Jesus of Nazareth was that he emerged out of a supernatural and divine time to become a real, live human being, thus becoming interested and involved in our own earthly world and the passage of time within it. Paul noted that Jesus' arrival on earth represented the fullness of time in his letter to the Galatians. And as far as Christians are concerned, Jesus' birth marked very clearly the beginning of a new era, and his death another. At the human level, we see the importance of these moments that seem to reset lives or change time. For Christians, St. Augustine's transformation from a worldly life to a saintly one is one of the key moments in the early church. Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola also exemplified this personal change from one way of life to another way of life. In their cases, through the founding of orders of priests with specific devotion to the Roman Church. And these ideas were well known by the reformers in the 16th century as well, although they manifested themselves in different ways. In remembering his conversion moment, Martin Luther famously said that when he reflected on Paul's letter to the Romans statement on faith and righteousness, that he said, "I felt that I was altogether born again, and that I had entered paradise through open gates." And this concept of being born again, starting one's life over, which is in so many ways a staple of evangelical Protestantism in the present day and a staple of Christian life for some time, came to a turning point in the Reformation. Now, these conversion moments often led to rebellion from the Roman Church rather than increased conformity to its rules as they had for so many centuries before. And as the varieties of Christianity changed, the devotional options for those experiencing sudden conversion naturally followed suit. And among the reformers of Europe, there was a very clear sense that God had intervened in the towns and the rural communities of the 16th century to provide an alternative to Roman Catholicism and in their minds make a better way forward. For so many of them, the Reformation had been a clear gift from God, one that was clearly signaling the end of days was near, and that people should take these signs seriously. The urgency of the need for reform in light of the impending apocalypse runs deep in early Calvinism, and the first Anabaptists certainly thought preparations were required for the end of the world, with the occupation of Munster in Germany in 1534-35 being only the most horrific example of this view. For John Knox, the idea of turning the page of history is perhaps most notable when someone literally turns the pages of his book, The History of the Reformation in Scotland. It is notable that only about 6 pages of Knox's history even deal with the period before the Reformation. It simply was not relevant. That was just the past. On with the future and making of new history. So for early Scottish reformers, like their continental European counterparts, the arrival of the Reformation marked a very new time, initiated by God and with the explicit desire to erase the Catholic past. And biblical or theological conceptions of time, of course, are only part of the story. And the most striking way in which time was changed in the everyday lives of Scottish Christians was in the everyday life of Scottish Christians whose church obligations were changed in significant ways. With the coming of the Reformation, the effect of townspeople's obligations to their church were near immediate through the significant expansion of the church's schedule. So, preaching was a priority in the Reformed tradition, and the changes in the frequency and prominence of it led directly to the expansion of the church's weekly program and the precision required of timekeeping and scheduling. In Glasgow, there was preaching in the town kirk on Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. And the Sunday preaching would be up to 3 hours, while the Wednesday and Friday preaching were designed to be 1 hour, although there were frequent complaints that the minister stay within the hour, indicating that he didn't always do so. In Scotland, they used to give them an hourglass, and they'd put it there and then it would go out, and everyone would say, "Oh, it's getting to the end," and then they would just turn it over and start over again, so people would be upset. If we compare Glasgow's sessions to another Scottish town, Perth, there's a similar pattern. 1578, Perth had its midweek sermons Thursday in addition to Sunday sermons, all of which would take between 1 and 3 hours. St. Andrews, there were specific instructions for people to stay within the hour. In the pre-Reformation Scottish Catholic Church, a regular townsperson would likely be expected to be in church on Sunday. And this may or may not take an hour, likely not, but for certain no one was taking attendance. And in the new system, in just the basic mandatory attendance at the preaching, the obligations of a layperson would expand to maybe 8 hours or more, and he or she would be fined for not showing up. And if you were an elder, the time commitments were even more significant. There were 55 elders in Glasgow, which was quite a large number for a town that size. In Glasgow, elders usually met every second Thursday, which was the day of the session, and Saturday was often used for collection for the poor. And when the kirk was in need of more urgent repair, there would be meetings for elders and craftsmen before or after the session. So session number for an elder, a session would be like, the people who were here before the event today, they come a half hour early and they stay a half hour later. One historian has noted that in 1579, Perth elders had to attend 59 meetings in addition to their Sunday session and preaching obligation. And as heady as these times would have been with the creation of a new church, these were still 59 staff meetings, many of which likely shared the stimulating characteristics of staff meetings in the present day. And just as the new Reformed Kirk in Glasgow attempted to reposition perception of weekly calendars, so too did it reorient the hours of the day. And for lay people, some of whom had no experience in the church, some of these changes must have been annoying. For instance, the 2 men asked to gather money for the poor in 1586 were instructed to be at the cathedral door at 4 o'clock in the morning and stay there until the services were complete, well into the afternoon. By 1587, this number was relaxed to 6 a.m., and by the end of the session records, 1593, it was 7 a.m. I think it's important here to pause for a moment to consider what some of these changes tell us about the Reformation. A most important thing is that the Reformed Church in Scotland was differently regimented rather than newly regimented. The rule of St. Benedict had all kinds of obligations for people to pray at odd hours of the day or stay up and practice their faith at odd hours, I suppose. The difference, these kind of actions in the Benedictine monastery leave no doubt about the rigor of medieval Christianity. The difference brought on by the Reformation was that there was an extension of this monastic ideal to all people. And it's important to note that the monastic ideal was extended to all people, whether they liked it or not. And the failures of people to meet these demands are what fill up the session records. Session books bear witness to the inability or lack of desire of people to conform. There were relentless fines for Sabbath breach and in the documents for those working and playing on the Sabbath. In 1591, the session literally redefined what a day was because people were working in their gardens at night so that the elders wouldn't see them. And they told the community that, quote, the brethren interprets from sun to be the Sabbath day, in a further attempt to redefine religious life on the grounds of time. And another change for Scottish Christians would come in the form of changes to the liturgical calendar. Scotland had followed the rest of the Reformed world in getting rid of saints' days and other days in the Catholic calendar, so it's not difficult for many people to find themselves out of line in this regard, as these holy days had become integrated into town life. In Glasgow, one case represents this well, what the Reformed Kirk called superstitious times. It occurred around Christmas in 1586 when Adam Elphinstone, from a convinced and consistently Catholic family, and his friends were jailed in late December by the session for their actions in association with Yule. The men had caused a ruckus in Glasgow when they, at 12 hours in the evening on the 20th day of December, instant called most superstitiously St. Thomas Eve, did pass through this town with pipe and tambourine to the trouble of sundry honest people who were sleeping in their beds, and raising up the old dregs of superstition used among the papists. Elphinstone was singled out by the group for his leadership role. In early January, he's called to the pillar, which was similar to the stool of repentance, when the stool of repentance would just be like a stool that you'd have, and while someone is preaching, while the minister is preaching for hours and hours on end, you sit there with a paper hat sometimes on your head that said your sin. And then after the preaching is done, the congregation decides whether you looked, contrite enough. And then if not, then you go back next week. And this is what happened to Adam Elphinstone. He, quote, did not repent, but entered into the pillar under mockery to the grief of sundry men in this town. And more strict punishment followed, and they explicitly said that his repentance should be humbly done. And the winter revelry for the Elphinstone family didn't end with Adam. His father, George Elphinstone, also found himself before the session. George took a dead horse's head and bones and put it against the minister's gate. This had all been part of an eventful evening that had seen the senior Elphinstone traveling through the town, associating with known Catholics, joking with prisoners, eating and drinking, and speaking daft words, as they say, at supper. And although Elphinstone continuously denied putting the bones on the minister's gate, he was convicted. And the fallout from the Yule celebrations had many consequences beyond this one family. The elders aggressively sought out who provided license for the pipers to play, who was involved in the drinking, the nature of the conversation. One man insisted that he told George Elphinstone to go to bed, but George did not listen. And this indicates well that how enforcing new rules about time was doubly effective in that it removed Catholic saints' days and also promoted like a pious town life, so central to Reformed Christianity. And maintaining adherences to a Catholic calendar wouldn't have bothered the session as much if these Catholic days had not been associated with drinking and swearing and vandalism and music and staying up late in the night. The characteristic associations of vice with these superstitious times were thus problematic because they were both Catholic and essentially too fun. So their prescription made connections between like an abandonment of the Catholic calendar and austere town life direct. For Catholics in this world where their faith was illegal, saints' days and holidays provided opportunities to remember the past and to practice their faith in spite of the risks. In remembering St. Thomas's Eve, the feast of St. Thomas, and going out to party, as they called it in England, going Thomasin, Catholics were certainly looking for an excuse to have fun, to drink wine, to tell their minister how they really felt about him, whether that meant putting a horse's carcass on his gate or not. But they were also insisting that the conceptions of time and therefore Catholic ideas be accounted for and asserted against the newly reformed social order. Catholics' insistence on celebrating elements of their faith were important to them, was what made them so dangerous, of course, to those looking to enforce the new ideal or new social order. And it is not coincidental that the same surnames that we see celebrating Catholicism in the 1580s are also the same surnames that we see protecting, housing, going to Mass when St. John Ogilvie, Scotland's only post-Reformation saint, comes to Glasgow in 1615 where he's martyred. It is Elphinstones, Haygates, protecting John Ogilvie, and various brave women in Glasgow as well, asserting themselves in more public and dangerous ways a couple generations down the line. So social uses of time corresponded well with other subtle expressions of Catholicism in the town. As some townspeople indicated their Catholicism through a saint's feast, others did so by adhering to a Catholic conception of sacraments, which had been reduced to baptism in the Eucharist in the Reformed Church. Baptism was particularly important in this regard, and Protestant conceptions of the sacrament diverged greatly. Late medieval Catholic understanding of baptism, not much different than our own desire for it to take place as soon as possible after birth, and that it be available relatively freely to anybody who sought it. In the Reformed tradition, it was much more difficult to get a baptism, and parents and godparents were all forced to endure public examinations of their knowledge of the faith. The new church's position on baptism is superbly exemplified in this 1588 group Act Against Ignorance, like ignorance being people who are ignorant. The Kirk ordains that all sundry fathers who have their bairns baptized shall tell distinctly the commandments of the eternal God, commandments of the church, the articles of faith, the creed, and the Lord's Prayer. And if your father cannot do this, found to want the same and be ignorant thereof, he shall be publicly shamed in the church and declared ignorant and judged unworthy to present these babies to baptism. All townspeople in Scotland in the 1580s and 90s grew up in the Catholic Church, and therefore most of them would have understood baptism in the Catholic way in those early years. They sought it as quickly as possible to guarantee guarantee removal of original sin. No small concern in these communities where a conservative infant mortality rate was about 35%. The sacrament was an essential duty of a parent, and certainly a matter of urgency. So in the new system that required an examination, those who were confident that they would fail the examination often lied. They presented babies born from extramarital affairs as if they were conceived within marriage. They relied on ex-priests who were in their communities to circumvent the authorities. And in doing this, I can't help but think that most thought they were deceiving the authorities with the best interests of their children in mind. And when they were found out, the session would punish them because their actions made it that there was, to quote the session, no difference betwixt the bairns lawfully and unlawfully gotten. This desire to create in-groups and out-groups was part and parcel of the public shaming campaign that we saw on display earlier, but the social control of what they saw as the sacramental gifts from God struck more to the heart of the Reformed desire to change church. The lack of urgency to perform baptism was permissible for Reformed leaders because their theology of baptism was different. Although the sacrament was important, it was absolutely linked to social life and only truly effective on the elect, those predestined for heaven by God. The creation of a godly community was more important maybe in these early years. I shouldn't say more important. Wasn't important, so baptism could therefore be held hostage from the ignorant. And all of this led to almost daily clashes in Glasgow between those who wished to control access to the sacraments and those who held a popular and Catholic, I think, desire to experience baptism's supernatural powers. Fights between parishioners and their ministers persisted into the 17th century, but one late 16th century case represents well the degree to which Catholic knowledge of the sacraments persisted. It began when the Scottish Church establishing a flock of their own, like a new parish, for the rural areas around the town, called the barony. And in an interesting reversal of our present world, with its stories of church closure, this was a story of church expansion. Not unlike our own world, however, parishioners did not always see eye to eye with the authorities. The rural people felt that they'd been shortchanged in the new arrangement and wished, like modern people do, to practice their faith in the community and congregation that they knew best. The church went ahead with the new arrangement anyway. It was decided that the minister would be Alexander Rowett, who had been the third minister in Glasgow at the time. So they had a big old parish. They branch off, start a new one. The third minister becomes the first minister at the new parish. As was custom, the new minister was instructed to preach before the parish in order for the parishioners to provide an evaluation of his abilities. So the minister would go up and give a sermon, and the congregation would decide whether his sermon was good enough and that whether he could be the minister. And when only one person attended, the authorities passed an act insisting that the parishioners attend, or else they said they shall receive no benefit of the kirk, which are the sacraments of baptism and the Holy Supper of our Lord Jesus. And when the parishioners continued to boycott, the presbytery, which is the court above the kirk session, the presbytery threatened them again and stood firm. And these barony men were not easily defeated, and they showed their perseverance by securing an act from the General Assembly, the highest court in the Scottish Church, which said that the kirk had to provide the benefits of the kirk, the sacraments, to the people. And the ministers continued to refuse, saying, you can get the sacraments if you want them, you just have to get them at this church under these conditions. And the rural parishioners protested this act as well, noting that they preferred to receive the sacraments in, quote, the Cathedral of Glasgow as their own parish kirk, according to their old accustomed use. And the disagreement came to a head on the 20th of March, 1596, and as the minister in the church was preaching before the baptism, Arthur Cahoon, representative of these barony men, expressed his displeasure. And there is Arthur Cahoon, having his sword in his hand, leaping over the women and crying up in a fury to the said Mr. John, this is the minister, being in the pulpit, and said to Mr. John, you will not baptize their bairns. And he had grabbed a baby in the process that wasn't his. So this man has a sword in one hand, a baby in another, and he's attacking the minister at the pulpit. And that said Arthur said, he was a barony man, and the said Mr. John was a minister, and he would have their bairns baptized, or else there should be nobody baptized that day. And that he said the pulpit was theirs, and he'd have them baptized in the choir, or else he should make the house do. So he's threatening, says nobody's going to be baptized in here unless our babies are baptized, and if you don't do it, I think this is key here, that they will make the house do. So those who doubt the degree to which these people in the past understood what was happening in church, or the complexities of the sacraments, need look no further than this fascinating case. In order to express his frustrations, Colquhoun, an everyday Christian from rural Scotland, targeted what he believed to be the heart of his church, the sacraments. He verbally and physically abused the minister, and he used the event of the sacrament as a place of protest. He insisted that this barony baby receive baptism and threatened the entire community by indicating that no baptisms would be performed if these barony children were excluded. And further to this, by indicating that the pulpit was theirs, meaning it belonged to the parishioners, he insulted the minister, and he had demoted the power of the new clergy's control over the word. Finally, and most interesting, Colquhoun threatened to subvert the entire order of the Reform project by asserting the power of parishioners to take sacramental matters into their own hands and to have a private baptism. In threatening to, quote, make the house do, he clearly knew that he was striking at a key element of Reformed theology that Calvin had envisioned, making baptism a child's entrance not only into the church but into society more generally. And private baptisms were a major violation in Reformed Christianity, but were relatively commonplace in the Catholic tradition. So just as the Scottish church leaders had used the sacraments to leverage their case against the parishioners, so too did the parishioners use the sacraments against the ministry. If Protestants were in search of a priesthood of all believers, they got it in Glasgow, just not the way that they wanted. And although the new traditions wanted to prioritize the scriptures and the pious, godly community, so many people continue to see the sacraments in a Catholic way that the fulcrum of their arguments remained access to the supernatural, saving power of God that people had sought for so many centuries. In this way, the Catholic view of the world maintained a certain social and sacramental status long after its legal status had changed. Although some of these squabbles over or when and how people went to church, how they saw God and the sacraments, what they saw as heresy, how they shamed their neighbors, may seem silly or quaint to us, they are important, more important to our own world than we might initially think. The changes that came about as a result of the Reformation in Europe led societies down vastly different paths. And the paths were so influential that they affect our politics, our economics, our social lives. I think they demand our attention. For example, American evangelical Christianity can be traced very clearly back to these people we are discussing in the early Scottish Reformation. The lines are about as straight as we can draw in history. If we want to understand this great force of political and social power in our world, we might want to look to its origins and try to understand how people came to think that way or how they came to be so powerful. An understanding of the intricacies of Christians' approaches to power, money, hierarchy, or independence seems, I think, to also strike at the heart of modern ecumenical movements in the Catholic Church. Ecumenism, of course, involves much more than simply standing around and telling other Christians that we like them and we don't care about differences. Real ecumenism means understanding and caring about Christian differences, and understanding those differences means approaching history in an honest way, so that people of the past are not little objects who didn't have televisions, whose ideas we understand superficially. And when we consider the people of the 16th century to be like you and I, but inhabitants of a particular context, we are able to do more honest analysis of our own world, and we can distinguish between history and nostalgia, a skill that is relevant in all societies. If history is important in our society and our faith communities, and ecumenism is among the stated goals of the modern church, then it is clear that we must support the ideas, must support instruction of religious ideas, and I think religious history in universities, and that we take the instruction from the universities into public life. I'm not talking only about catechetical instruction, which has its place, but instead the academic analysis of religious ideas and their dissemination into the larger world, where they can promote better understandings of people, past and present. Where I work at St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba, we teach about 400 students a year in our Catholic Studies program, the largest in Canada by nearly every measure. These are students from different faith and ethnic backgrounds who take our courses voluntarily. Mennonites, Catholics, Jews, Buddhists, people who have never been to church, people who never miss church, Nigerians, Filipinos, French Canadians, Indigenous students, on and on. And they all take our courses because the subject matter interests them and because they know that these ideas are applicable to most other fields of study. Most importantly, however, they take our courses because our courses are offered. And they are offered because St. Paul's and the larger university agree that they're important. This insertion of religious ideas into larger conversations is why institutions like Assumption University are so important and why I'm so happy to have been invited back here today. Catholic campuses' very existence to speak to conversations that need to be had more often, that can be both academic and social, and that can be valuable within the university and in public life. Like the Catholics in early modern Scotland, Assumption and other smaller campuses work to insert their particular understanding of the world into campus discourses and make these conversations better as a result. So we should support these initiatives as best we can, knowing that church is always changing, ever ancient, ever new. But in better understanding Christianity's past, we can better contend with how church is changing now, or how we might hope to change it in the future. Thanks very much.